Hello, everyone. I'm so excited for this panel. It has some of my absolute favorites. I have read all of these books and I love them so much. So when I got this email, I was so excited to do this. Just so we are all clear, we also have like an anti-harassment policy. So if you are engaging in that kind of behavior, um, you will be blocked, and that will be very sad for you. Anyway, we're going to be chatting about Asian folklore and just folklore in general and YA fantasy books. I am the moderator for today. My name's Lily, and I am the book blogger slash book person, I guess, behind the umbrella of Utopia State of Mind. And that's all I'm going to say because I really want to get into the panel. But anyway, let's introduce the authors are going to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the questions.
I will start. My name is Tracy Chi. I'm the author of a number of books, most of them fantasy, the Reader Trilogy, and then more recently, A Thousand Steps into Night, which came out at the beginning of March. It is a Japanese-influenced folktale feminist road trip about a young girl named Miyuko who is out running errands for her father one day when she is very unceremoniously cursed to become a demon, which sends her away from her village to like reverse this curse and out onto the road where she's like, you know what? Life is pretty good outside of my village, perhaps, with all of these other things I can do and new freedoms and new powers that I have. And I don't know if I want to go back.
Hi, I'm Kylie Lee Baker. I am the author of The Keeper of Night, which is a dark historical fantasy about a half British Reaper, half Japanese Shinigami girl who runs away from her home in Victorian England to Japan, where she makes a dangerous deal with Japan's goddess of death and has to kill 3 yokai, which are kind of like Japanese folkloric demon creatures, in order to gain acceptance. So happy to be talking to everyone today.
I feel like I should clap at the end of every introduction. So, Axie or me? Are we going in that order?
You can go, Van.
Okay, since I'm already talking. So I'm Van Huang, and I'm the author of Girl Giant and the Monkey King. It's about a super strong girl who deals with a lot of problems due to her powers. So in order to get rid of it, she makes a deal with the demon trickster god, the Monkey King. And the sequel, Girl Giant and the Jade Lord, came out a couple months ago. So yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Elizabeth Lim. I'm also the author of a couple of books, Spin the Dawn up there, which my publisher gave me a while back, so it's helpful, and a couple of books with Disney. And my latest is Six Crimson Cranes, which is a reimagining of the Wild Swans fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, but with woven in with a lot of my favorite East Asian myths.
Yay! My name is Axie O, and I'm the author also of like several books, sci-fi and contemporary, but my latest is a fantasy, a YA fantasy, The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. It's a YA reimagining of a Korean folktale, The Tale of Shinchang, about a girl whose world is plagued by storms, these deadly storms, and is cursed by the sea gods. So she has to journey to the sea god's realm in order to figure out what's going on and bring an end to the storms once and for all. So I'm so excited to talk to you guys about Asian mythology. Yay!
Yeah, and also like what gorgeous covers. I feel like making the graphics for this panel was such a sincerely satisfying experience to put everybody's covers next to each other. So I think what we should start off first is let's just talk about what do you think, or what do you all think are some differences between Asian and Western folklore?
I want to actually hear from Elizabeth on this because yours is inspired by like a Western fairy tale, right? And I am really interested in kind of how you took that Western fairy tale, but then added these Eastern influences, which is, I feel like, kind of maybe the opposite of what some of us have done. And so, Elizabeth, you go first, please.
Okay. So I was thinking about this question, and I feel like I don't really have a black and white answer about what the differences are, but just like off the top of my head, I feel like a lot of I was just thinking about villains, for instance. One of the big changes between my story, Six Crimson Cranes, and the original Wild Swans is that I really tried to flesh out the villain, who is typically in the stepmother, the queen, and tried to give her more reason and more of a fleshed out character in my story, rather than just like this black and white sort of vague reason for cursing everyone into swans in the original fairy tale. And that sort of led me to think about a lot of the folk tales that I grew up with. Like a lot of the Chinese folk tales, for instance, that I love, like there isn't necessarily always this like very evil antagonist. There's oftentimes the villain has like a bit more nuance, I feel, or in that sense, like the villain might be the weather, or like not necessarily like this evil queen. Like I think in a lot of Western fairy tales, the villain is often like this woman, which I feel is a bit annoying. So that's just like one of the differences. I feel like I could probably write an essay if I thought more about this, but I haven't thought about it as much as I should. So that's just like one of the things that popped into my mind and like is worth a lot more thought, I think.
Yeah, just kind of adding on to that, the villain thing, I think about kind of like these Japanese children's folk tales that I read while I was growing up. Sometimes there wasn't really a villain in them at all, right? Sometimes it was like a very kind of ordinary character would stumble into kind of a magical situation, have some sort of an encounter with the spirit, and then the antagonist would kind of be their own folly, right? And they would kind of bring ruin upon themselves, or they would bring hardship upon themselves, depending on how they reacted to like this encounter with the magical. And so I think that's a really interesting observation about kind of the differences in villains between kind of these Western fairy tales and maybe these more Eastern inspired folk tales. For me, something that I was thinking a lot about in A Thousand Steps into Night was kind of the nature of the protagonist as well. I tried to stay away from, well, let's say I was really drawn to the idea that the protagonist, the main character, could be very unexceptional. And I think this is something that showed up for me in a lot of these like old children's stories, was that like it'd be like an old woodcutter who's like, he's not great at his job. He's not great at woodcutting. He's just kind of going about his everyday life, right? Chopping the wood, growing old, or like, and one of the most famous kind of Japanese children's tales, Momotaro, it's an old couple who like miraculously comes upon this peach, and like there's a baby boy born from the peach, but like they're old people, and they're just like good old people, you know what I mean? And I really was drawn to that, as opposed to kind of Western fairy tales. And I grew up in like the age of Disney, like the princess age of Disney, right? And where those fairy tales tend to be much more about like royalty and castles and kind of like these people who were larger than life. And so when it came time for me to write something that was kind of inspired by Japanese folk tales, I was really drawn to the ordinary, right? Just an ordinary person who's trying to go about her life, and she's not exceptional really in any way. Rather than kind of going big and royal and grand with it.
Yeah, I agree. Like I totally made my character like as awkward as possible. And like even though she had like the superpower, it like didn't make her amazing. It actually like made her problems so much worse, and I really love the idea. And then also, yeah, I didn't realize that like you're right, all the villains are women. Like what is that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read everyone's books yet. I need to. I have all of your books. I have to read them all. But you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like all of us take from all different folklore and put it into our books. It's not necessarily a straight retelling of like, a one folk tale. And I thought that was so interesting, because the reason I did that is because, growing up in the West, we're so familiar. I was so familiar with all these Western fairy tales, like Cinderella, Snow White, and all these retellings. But with the Asian fairy tales, for me specifically, like Korean fairy tales, I didn't know a lot of them. Like I didn't have a lot of them growing up. And so when I would watch, the Western fairy tale, or I could watch anything, like I would watch like American TV, and they would reference all these different Western fairy tales, and I would understand all those references. But they never had, if they put a reference of a Korean folktale into like a Western TV, I'd be like so excited. But that never ever happened. I would only ever see that in like K-dramas. And so like when I heard this question, I was like, well, my first answer would be like, there's just so much, we know so much about Western fairy tales, and we don't know as much about Eastern fairy tales. So, in my exploration of my book, it's like a reimagining, retelling, but I put in like I just put in everything because I wanted someone to, when they're reading the book, to not only have like that, if they know the original folktale, it's fun, but also if you know all these different like Eastern, Asian myths, then it'll be really fun. You'll recognize the dragon, and we could have a whole conversation about the differences between Eastern dragons and Western dragons because I love Eastern dragons. They're good. They're like usually associated with water, right? And I think it's like the same in all East Asian cultures. Maybe, I'm not sure. But when I was thinking of this question, I was thinking of with Western versus Eastern, there's just so much more commercial or mainstream knowledge of Western fairy tales as opposed to Eastern fairy tales. So that was just like the main difference for me.
Yeah.
Everyone said really interesting things. So I'll just quickly add, sort of going back to what Tracy said about how in some Eastern fairy tales you'll see, or folklore rather, you'll see more adventure coming from ordinary things. And I don't want to speak too broadly about all Asian folklore, but just specific to the Japanese folklore I'm familiar with, I've noticed that a lot of it is not even centered on people. Like a lot of yokai are animals or objects. Like you have some yokai that are just umbrellas that hop around. So that's one thing that I think is different, that the focus is more on every part of the world and not everything is quite so human-centric, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I feel like that point, Elizabeth's point about villains, I feel like we could have such an in-depth, really detailed conversation about all of your stories. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say villains, but like all of your stories, forces of challenges or challenging forces, I guess. And they are just so nuanced and complex. I heard that and I was like, oh my God, that would be an amazing idea. But what we want to talk about as well, though, is what creative liberties have you taken with these stories, and sort of what elements did you retain or change, or what were the choices and like that thought processes behind that?
I can start off this one because I took so many liberties. Like I didn't base let's say the world of Awara, which is kind of the world of 1,000 Steps into Night, is very, very loosely inspired by these Japanese folktales that I read. Like there's no kappa, there's no tanuki, right? There's no kitsune. There's nothing that you would find in actual Japan, because I very intentionally set the world of 1,000 Steps into Night in a secondary, like an alternate world fantasy. And so my hope was that it would have the feel of these kind of Japanese children's folktales without actually being Japan. And so part of that was, I made up a whole new language. There's like a new geography. I made up new spirits and new demons. And so I took I took very many liberties. And part of that is because, I'm fourth generation Japanese American. I grew up in the United States, and I didn't know that I felt quite right setting something in a historical fantasy Japan. I didn't know if that was quite mine to tackle, but I did feel like these folk tales were a part of my childhood, and a part of my kind of imaginary landscape. And so I felt like that's something that I could do with, and that's something that really excited my imagination as well. And so nothing you find there, you're gonna find in actual Japan.
I struggled with that a lot, and like I was very afraid that I definitely took a lot of liberties with the story of the Monkey King, and I was always like, oh my gosh, everyone's gonna be so mad at me, yada yada. But like mythology exists in the time that it does to explain what's happening in the world and to help people who are living in that present moment. So I feel like it's it's only right that you take all this history and you like change it to meet whatever you need, or like as a writer, or like what readers need at the time. So like I feel like it's totally okay, you know, like I have to give myself permission, and I have to say that a lot, but like I'm gonna do it and not feel guilty about it anymore.
No, I really love that. I feel like one of my like big MOs is that it's just fantasy. It's like it's fiction. You can have fun. You can do, I feel like you read all these like fun fantasy books and it's not about accuracy for those books. So like why does it have to be accuracy for our for our Asian fantasy books? And with my book, like I said, like it's a reimagining of a Korean folktale, but the main character is completely, I made her up. She's named after a K-pop star. She's not really, but she does share a name with one of my favorite K-pop stars. And so like it's more like it's not about it's just putting in all the things that you love into a story and just making it really fun, something that you want to read. Like I was more influenced actually by authors like Dinah Wynne Jones and authors like Gail Carson Levine, who did a lot of fairy tale retellings. Like I grew up in that era of like all those books that I absolutely loved. And I kind of, with my book, I want to do a similar thing where it's just a fantasy romance, but the culture is Korean, because that's just what I feel really attached to, and obviously because I'm Korean, and just like the culture that I grew up in, I love so much. But it's again like Tracy, like you were saying, it's not necessarily like Korea. I never call it Korea. Like the characters have Korean names, and I do use actual Korean mythological creatures. So all of the mythological creatures that do show up in my book are like Korean creatures, and they share the name of the actual creature. But it's not like I don't like. I think I talk about like an emperor. Korea never had an emperor. They only ever had kings. So like there's like there's like inconsistencies, inaccuracies, and sometimes when I'm in panels, I'm like, let me just like clarify it's not historical, which is fine. Like I don't mind. I love historical fantasies, and there's elements of that in that it is, I guess, takes place in a world inspired more by historical Korea than modern Korea in that way. But I definitely think for me it's just having fun and not worrying too much. Yeah.
I think it's impossible to really make a totally faithful story based on folktales or anything, because you're changing the context in which these characters appear, and they're interacting with people that they don't normally in their legends. And I agree with everyone that I don't think people should expect to find something completely factual in any sort of fiction book. I can say that for me, one thing that went into my decision making was figuring out what to do with all the different contradicting versions of the stories that I saw, because it's not like, oh, here is this one folktale that is written in stone and this is how it happened. Like a lot of the tales of yokai are very different depending on what part of the country that they're told. So one thing I had to think about is, which one do I use? Do I combine them? I ended up combining most of them. I chose my favorite ones. I just made like a generic dark yokai story that I thought would be interesting to people. But I did try to retain the core features so that it would at least be recognizable to some people. So that kind of translates to like, what did this creature do to humans and how? So that like there's this very baseline level of someone might recognize where this came from. But I agree with everyone else that I think it's fine to change things. I think legends change and grow even within their original countries. So we're just contributing to that.
So for me, I think I was a little nervous on the onset of writing Six Crimson Cranes, because I knew I was taking this Western fairy tale and kind of just dropping it into an East Asian reimagined universe. But I just decided to go ahead with it anyway, because it was always something that I wanted to do when I was a kid. Like Tracy, I grew up in like the Disney princess era, and my daughters are kind of going through this right now. My eldest daughter is obsessed with Ariel, and she's always saying, oh, she wants red hair and blue eyes. And part of me, like inside, I'm just like, no. So when I conceived of the idea of Six Crimson Cranes, like it was really important for me to kind of marry my childhood obsessions with Disney princesses, but also relate them to the culture that I grew up with. Because I think like a lot of people in diaspora, especially like Asian Americans, we kind of have to struggle with both having grown up with Western influences, but also wanting to learn more about our own culture. And so that was something that I was very, that I thought about a lot as I was writing. So I think it's a long way of going, of saying that, like, I one of the biggest changes basically is just like dropping this Western fairy tale into an East Asian world, and then trying to marry in some of the myths and legends that I loved into this Western setting. And it was really fun. I would do it again.
Yeah, I loved them all so much. I'm just basking in the, as everyone says something, I just like remember something that happened from the book, and I'm like, oh yes, I want to talk about that. And it's like, this is not what that is. So I also wanted to know, what are your different purposes for incorporating these folk tales into your novels? And also, what do you think about the rise of stories inspired by folk tales? Because I feel like when I was growing up, I was also growing up in the Disney, I guess, era. I'm not really sure if that era is done, but the Disney other VHS era, I guess. And so I didn't really grow up with things like these, or even when I was like a teen, I didn't really see them. So I'm interested also in like everyone's thoughts about the rise of them as well.
Like somebody who's like obsessed with mythology, like of any form or culture, like I love this, you know, like I love all the different stories coming out. Like I want to read everything, and then I want to learn everything, and then I get like obsessed with like a culture's mythology, and then I'll like read all the folk tales. So I love it.
Something that Van said earlier about like the tales change depending on context, and like we have a new context here that kind of, I think, brings new life and like sheds a new light on kind of these older tales. And I think part of my purpose in writing 1,000 Steps Into Night had to do with like fusing kind of like what felt like an old folktale, what felt like it could be a classic fairy tale, both with its kind of Japanese folkloric influences, and also it draws really heavily on the hero's journey, which is like a Western mythic storytelling structure. I also wanted to talk about sexism and patriarchy in America, right, at the same time. And so like these were two of my purposes. And so, and I think actually, I hope you can speak to this too, because yours is a very feminist, like reimagining of an old folktale too. But like part of my purpose was to like use perhaps the vehicle of what feels like a folktale, what feels like a classic, in order to kind of shed more light and like interrogate and engage with the problematic institutions and structures that are going on in my world right here, right now, and I think are in many of our readers' worlds as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's interesting because when you write, I think for me, when I write a book, I'm not thinking in terms of themes, and I'm not when I'm writing a book, and then at the end, I'm like, wow, I said all these things. I didn't realize I did this. But with The Girl Fell Beneath the Sea, the original folktale it's based off of came out of because Korea, I think it must have been during the Chosun period, which was like a very Confucianist period. So it was a very patriarchal period. And the original folktale, the main, I guess, moral of the story is that a daughter should sacrifice herself for her father. It's like filial piety is the main thing you're supposed to take away from the story. The Tale of Shinchang, because it's about a girl who her father is like blind, and she like sacrificed herself for 300 bags of rice to the sea god so that he'll have 300 bags of rice, and then the sea god like he rewards her for her love for her father. And so it was interesting because I wanted to, but there's that, but that story's still beloved in Korea, obviously. Like it's one of its most famous folktales. So it's like I wanted to reimagine it for a modern audience where I made it like more feminist, where the girl character has more agency. I wanted to make it not ableist, so like the father is blind, and then at the end of the original folktale, he's cured of blindness. And I was like, that's not going to happen in my book, because I know I'm writing for a modern audience. I know I'm writing for readers who want to feel safe in this world. And if I include things that might have been, the mainstream back in whatever 1800s, 1300s Korea, aren't necessarily 21st century Korean readers, or readers who are reading this story. And so with my folktale, it was about knowing that and honoring the original folktale in that the Shinchang, like main characters, the side character Shinchang, the relationship with her father is still huge in the book. Like it's still like their love is what's important. And so I wanted that to be really important, because I don't want it to dismiss filial piety even. Like I didn't want to dismiss that, because that is very important in Asian culture, like love of father, love of or the respect for your elders, that sort of thing. I wanted to still honor that, but also, talk about female agency, talk about how, these traditions, what are they born of? Are they born of like the patriarchy, or are they born of women trying to take control of their lives? So I definitely think when I'm writing this book, it's like interesting, because like the original folktales and the myths come from years and years and years and years of history and society. But then, I am just one person who was born with my own worldview. So I'm writing this book with my own worldview, which I think is so cool, and why we need more stories by Asian American creators, because everyone will have a different worldview. So I think, that's what I was thinking when I was writing Girl. It's sort of like, at the time I was just like, I want to have fun, and after it I was like, wow, there are some deep things happening.
Piggybacking off Axie a little bit, I love that you brought up filial piety, and also that when you mentioned when you first started writing the book, you didn't really think too much about purpose. I'm definitely the same way. And thinking about Six Crimson Cranes, and also the differences between Western fairy tales and Asian ones, I think something that Western fairy tales focus on a lot is romantic love, versus like in Asian fairy tales, we have a lot more like family. And something that I ended up concentrating a lot on in Six Crimson Cranes is the different types of love that are developed over the course of the story, and that are and so Shiori, my main character, like she obviously romantic love is something that happens over the course of the book. I mean, I love writing romance, so of course it's going to happen. But also, I think more importantly, her relationships with her brothers, her stepmother, her father are ones that I really tried to focus on, and I felt like that ended up being a big driver of the plot and her development in the book, and that's something I'm pretty happy with.
I'm kind of similar to Axie in the sense that as I was researching a lot of Japanese folklore and mythology for my book, one thing I wanted to do was raise some of my criticisms with certain aspects of it, like ableism. I can't say a whole lot without spoiling the twist of the book, but it was important to me to criticize some things that I read. But another, I don't know if this was really a driving purpose, but something that did occur to me as I was writing this book about different folkloric creatures in Japan was to try to show some of the diversity, because I do think the canon of Japanese creatures is very diverse. Like there's thousands of them out there, much more than at least I am familiar with in terms of Western folklore. And I think a lot of people have a very limited view of what Japanese culture actually is. Like to a lot of people, it's like, oh, it's just anime and sushi. And I know that compared to America, Japan is racially a lot more homogenous, but that doesn't mean it's not diverse. There's a lot of differences in terms of, how stories are told in the different places around Japan. And so I deliberately set my scenes with different yokai in different parts of Japan so that people could see the different personalities of those places and the different things, I want to say fears and values that you can see reflected in the kinds of stories that they told. So that's something I thought about while I was writing, and hopefully did well, but who could say?
I also wanted to remind people that if they have any questions, they can start to put them in the chat. One final, or not one final question, but another question that I had was if you felt that you had to cater any of your books or your folk tales to Western audiences, since like they're sold here and not, I don't know how else to frame that.
I can answer this if no one else wants to jump in. I did make certain compromises with a US audience in mind. Like one part of that would be the choice in language. Like for the marketing copy for my book, we sort of gloss the word yokai as yokai demons, so that people understand what that is. And like, I'm fine with that because like the ones I chose are antagonists. But yokai are not really the same thing as demons because not all of them are bad. So we do have there's similar examples of sort of glossing or oversimplifying Japanese terms throughout the book. And also I'm aware that while I didn't really change this, I am aware that the folkloric creatures that I chose are pretty palatable to an American audience. Like they're different from what people would normally see, but they're not too different. Like we've got like a sea vampire and like a snow creature and like a fox shapeshifter. Whereas there are some yokai that are like cyclones full of weasels or like umbrellas and stuff that, you know, might not fly as well in YA fantasy for an American audience. And so I am aware of that. But one thing I also try to think about in terms of catering to American audiences is that Western audiences also include Asian Americans and other diaspora Asians, because not every Asian person grows up speaking the language of their heritage or immersed in their culture. So for me, as someone whose family has been in America for several generations, there's not always a crystal clear division between Western and Asian audiences, especially because my book is pretty much about this girl who goes to Japan, and everywhere she goes, she's told, oh, you don't speak Japanese well enough. What are you doing here? And she feels so ashamed that she doesn't know more about her culture. So I think that's part of the reason it wasn't a big deal for me to make sure to do things like glossing certain Japanese terms to make sure that my book was a bit more broadly accessible to people like my main character. And I don't think that's always the best or only way to write a book about, you know, Asian folklore or mythology. Just that in my particular case, I didn't feel like I had to make any changes that compromised the integrity of the story I was trying to tell.
Yeah, I really like the word that you used, compromise, because I feel like that's sort of also what I would do sometimes, is that it wouldn't be, and you're not compromising the integrity. You're just, it's a different type of compromise where it's like, it's not like I would never compromise the integrity. But for things like language, like you said, and specifically for me in my like career of writing, it's been names that were really important, because I'd rather the name, when you sound it out in English, like with the way it's written, was pronounced correctly than butchered. Because I grew up, being called Axie Ho, you grow up with this and you just realize you don't want that for your characters. You, in a way, you feel protective of your characters in your world. So when I name my characters, I kind of name them in a way where if you read the name, like if you were just an English speaking person, like if you read the name Mina, you probably would pronounce it Mina, right? And you wouldn't need a enunciation guide, which is fine too. Like I love that kind of stuff too. But that is something that I think about when I write, just because that mattered to me, because I grew up, my name being Axie, people, saying it wrong and stuff. And so things like that. Writing from, so like the stubborn part of me is like, I'm not going to change anything for anyone. I'm going to write whatever I want. And I have also had like mini battles for little things. Like my first book, we changed the title so that it's like Rebel Soul, which was fine. I love that. But I've had friends do the opposite, where they had a title that was Korean and had to change it to English. And things like that, where the title wasn't, or there are words in the book that weren't, quote unquote palatable to Western, or non-living. What's the word? What would be the opposite of Western? I guess Eastern, but like because I agree with you, Kylie. Like when people say like Western, I grew up in New York. Like I'm like very Western in the sense that you know, like my dad loves baseball. I don't know. I don't know what like American pastimes are. But saying that, yeah, I think I definitely have compromised in that way, but never in a way where I felt like I was doing a disservice to the book. And I do, when I write my books, for girls specifically, I didn't include any Korean words. Like in my first debut novel, I included for Rebel Soul, I included like when they're like in conversation, like in Korean, there's like a hierarchical speaking with people. So like if I was calling my like, you know, older brother, I'd call him oppa, right? Mina doesn't say that in Girl. She would just call her older brother by his name, which is technically incorrect if it was in Korean. But I did that on purpose because I was trying to, the style of the book, like I even had my editor suggest, oh, you could put more Korean in it if you want. And I was like, no, just this book. I don't think I didn't think I wanted it for this book. It didn't, because it would seem more of like, for me, more of a historical fantasy than just like a straight up fantasy where the only Korean words I used were the names for the mythological creatures. So I use the word like imugi, which is like the name for like the proto dragons, just because there's no other word for it in English, right? But I didn't put in all those things, which I did in Rebel Soul, and which I did for like other books I've written, and which I think is really great. I love that too. But I didn't do that for Girl because I just didn't think it felt right for the book specifically, because I just wanted it to be I don't know. I don't know. There's some like we could talk more of like about why the psychological reasons for doing these things. But for me, it was more like the suited for this book. I didn't need it. The like having those Korean words. Yeah. But I love it when I read historical fiction when Korean words appear. And I love talking to people about this kind of stuff too, because we're like, so did you use the word door or did you use the Korean word for door? We have like these long conversations of like, when do you pick out which words to use in an English reading text? So yeah, I have all these thoughts all the time about this kind of stuff. So I love this question.
I really wish there were more words for robes. I guess I just barged in, so I'm gonna tell my part. I agree a lot with what Axie said. For Spin the Dawn, which was a book I wrote several years ago, I definitely made the conscious decision not to use any Chinese words because in an earlier draft when I did, I found myself getting really bogged down by the history and the meaning behind those words, and to the point that it like held me back from telling the story, because I was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much history behind this word. I feel like I need to really explain it to my readers and then like have to be super faithful even though it's a fantasy. So I ended up taking them out, and then for some reason that actually really freed me up to tell the story. And that's what I've been doing going forth with like Six Crimson Cranes, which is in the same world. So yeah, but I love historical fantasy too, and I love it when other authors are able to share more.
I'm gonna jump in here because language was so important in 1,000 Steps Into Night. Like me and my friend Ariel Mackin made up a language, like very basic building blocks of a language. You could not write poetry in it, for example. But that was really important to me because, like Axie, I was going to be kind of including non-Western creatures that like English would not have a word for, but I also didn't want to use Japanese words for those creatures because it's not set in Japan, so the Japanese language doesn't exist. So I would have to like create new words for these creatures that are kind of inspired by Japanese folklore but aren't from Japanese folklore. And so again, like similar to, I think, both of you, I don't use Japanese words for clothing in 1,000 Steps Into Night. I don't use Japanese words for food in like you won't find it. I won't even use the word for chopsticks, right? Because it was important to me to make that delineation kind of as clear as I could without having at the beginning, in like long time ago in a world that was not Japan, but completely made up by the author, right? Like I wanted to make that as clear as I could to reading audiences, that it isn't Japan, that you're not going to learn anything about Japan from reading this text. It's not a comment on Japanese social structures from like the 1800s. no, it's made up. And so part of that was in the creation of this language, which I hoped would sound, you know, a little like Japanese, and the fact that it's like syllabic and like a lot of the syllables end with a vowel instead of like kind of being closed off by a consonant, as in Japanese. But I also included those footnotes, which I had so much fun with, partially because I've seen this criticism about novels that are inspired by non-Western cultures, where they're like, I don't know how to pronounce that, right? Like readers will come across a word that they don't immediately know how to parse, and then they'll gloss over it, and then when they speak about it, they're like, you know, blah blah blah. And I wanted to help people resist that that impulse by providing like handy dandy pronunciation guides. And then like I have a footnote on the very first page, and in that footnote it has a pronunciation, and it says very clearly in the language of Aurora. So not in Japanese language, like, and so like I really tried hard to make it clear. And like I still don't know how successful this was, because readers will bring what they bring to a text. But it was part of my intent to make sure that this was different, that this was not historical fantasy. This is not Japan. It's not here to teach you anything about Japan. Although I do hope that it encourages questioning and thinking about American society.
Yeah, making up your own language is really smart, especially when you're like a diaspora Asian, because like every time I added like a Vietnamese word in my book, I would always be like, oh my God, everyone's gonna read this and think like, oh, she's so like you could tell she doesn't speak Vietnamese for real, you know, even though I do, like that was my first language and everything. And then I would like be like, oh, should I have my sister check this? And I'd be like, no, like I'm Vietnamese too. Like there's like that stubbornness of like, no, I'm like I know what I'm talking about. But then during the copy edits, I got like a lot of comments about like, are you sure this is accurate? Like, is this really correct? So, you know, it kind of like bit me in the butt. But going back to our question, which was, did you have to like make compromises, right? So like my novel is inherently about like internal racism, because it's about like this girl who's Asian and she's going to school in like a predominantly white place. And like, I think like I really had to like come to terms with that in myself, and that's why like writing this book was so hard at first. Like I had a few false starts, and you know had a few rough drafts before I could like really dive into the heart of the story. But I think like because we are, you know, like Asian people writing in like a white society, like this is just something we have to deal with, and we're just constantly like making compromises or like having to decide what battles are worth fighting and what we have to like what we can, you know, like just gloss over, I guess. So I felt like during this entire book I had to be like very careful with what I said or how I said it. Like basically like every moment in the book I had to be like, is this a battle that I want to fight here, or is it a battle I want to fight over there? And like there are still a few lines where like I feel like, oh my God, like I'm still gonna get somebody being angry about me saying this in this book, you know, but I just think that, you know, like some things are worth it, you know, so yeah.
Yeah, I love that answer so much, and this idea of like knowing that there are going to be some things that you have to push back on, and then there are going to be things that, as a bunch of people were saying as well, that like don't compromise the integrity, but are also things that like you should save your battle strength, I guess, for other things. One question we got, which I thought was really interesting, was if there are any folklores or fairy tales that you're interested in developing in your novel in the future. But wait, one other thing I wanted to say as well, though, Kylie, I'm disappointed now to know that there's no cyclones of weasels in your sequel. But anyway, that was a side note. But yeah, the original question was if there are any folk tales or fairy tales that you'd be interested in developing like in the future into a book.
So I write for a middle grade audience, and I'm not really sure how to handle this, but I'm really obsessed with like the Vietnamese version of hell. There's like different layers and like levels of tortures, and the deeper you go, the worse it gets. And then what's interesting is that there are 18 hells, and the first 10 are ruled by kings, and those are like the originals. But then I guess they like ran out of space because so many people were going to hell, you know, so they had to add like 8 more levels of hell, and those they gave to queens. So it's like, why do the kings have 10 hells, and why do the queens only have 8, and why are they at the bottom, you know? So that's like something I want to write about next, but I just don't know how to make something so dark for a middle grade audience. So that will be my next challenge.
On the subject kind of yokai, as I was researching Japanese folktales, I read a lot of about yokai and about kind of ghost stories. And one of the things that really struck my imagination, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet, was one, the idea that if an inanimate object exists for 100 years, it develops sentience and it develops a spirit. And I find that, and that's how like we would get like the umbrella, right, that can hop around on one leg. And I'm really taken by that idea that inanimate objects have a spirit to them that could appear after a very long time and kind of very long prolonged use. And then the other thing that I really love is I came across this idea of what's like a yokai parade, where like once a year all of these yokai kind of go out on this parade, kind of roaming the streets, and it's like all different kinds. And like at that time of whenever this happens, like you should stay away from them, and there's like I think some sort of ritual like to get them away from you. And I really love this idea of like a yokai parade of like the really creepy ones, and then also like the weird little ones. Like one of my favorites that I came across was there's a yokai that kind of looks like a praying mantis, and as you pass by, it'll cut your hair. And that's it. That's all it does. Like, and so like you could have like these really monstrous ones that like eat people, but also like the little cutting hair spirits as well in this yokai parade. And so I don't know what I'm gonna do with it, but I really love kind of those two things.
Have you seen the movie where the Miyazaki film where they have the yokai parade?
The movie? Are you talking about Spirited Away, where they?
No, it's the one with the raccoons that attack the humans. There's a yokai parade that goes on for like way too long, but it's very interesting.
I do like the idea of like demons who are only responsible for causing like little minor inconveniences and not like huge, you know, not like huge attacks, but just like, I don't know, like a pebble in your shoe that you can never get rid of or something.
I was waiting for my dog to stop barking. But yeah, I mean, I love that. And Van, what you were saying about addressing like these darker stories for middle grade audiences, I loved darker stories when I was in middle grade. Like I love that kind of stuff, and I loved, and even like speaking of how Miyazaki, like even his children's movies are like they have so many dark elements in them, and I love that. I think that like kids when they're younger, that's when they're sort of introduced to these sort of elements, and it's like they can absorb it better than adults think they can, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yes,
totally
right.
agree.
You gotta do it. I want to read it. And Korea also has like I don't know a lot about it, like, but there's movies that I've watched about the Korean hells, which is also ruled by like different rulers, and they like torture you in different ways. It's just like, wow, Asia. Yes. But yeah, I think for me, it's less, I think if I wanted to do a retelling, it would be less of a straight up retelling of something, and it would be something like inspired by an element in a folktale and like sort of just, you know, riffing off that. That's something I would want to do. There's these things called, they have them in Japan and China too, but they're like celestial maidens, right? That they have like they come from the sky and they have superpowers, and I love that. And that's also in Korea. In Korea, they're called Sonya. I think like in Japan they're called Tenya or something like that. But I don't know. But in Korea they're called Sonya, which I guess in translation means fairies.
Yeah.
But the idea is that they're like celestial maidens. They come down from the heavens and they like take off their celestial robes and bathe in things, and woodcutters come upon them. Like it's a very like Asian kind of myth sort of thing. And I love the idea of like just like women from the sky who are powerful. Like the idea of that. I mean, I don't know about any of the other mythological things, but I'm like, that just sounds cool. I can riff off that. Let's work with that. So things like that, where for me, it's less about being like, oh, let me retell this story of the original folktale and let me retell it, and more like what was this element I just think is super cool, what can I do with it, is something that I want to do and I would do, and that I am doing. So yay, yeah, that kind of stuff really appeals to me.
I guess I've been a little quiet because I'm also like writing stuff already, so I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to share. But like something that has been that I'm interested in is like growing the world that I've created in Spin the Dawn and Six Crimson Cranes, and kind of like creating this this map of not just China but also like other parts of Asia, and in like creating this world in a way a lot of my favorite fantasy authors created worlds when I was younger, and I was like, how come we don't have this for Asian writers? And like in Six Crimson Cranes, I kind of introduced like shape shifting dragons and like talking cranes, for instance, and also like moon goddesses with magical rabbits, and that's like there's so much potential in these stories, and that I just want to keep going with them, but like maybe on a different spin. So we'll see.
Tracy, the movie is called Pom Poko. And also, I realized I didn't actually answer the question. I just talked about a raccoon movie for a second. So just to briefly answer it, similar to what Tracy was saying, there's so many yokai. There's such a fountain of inspiration. Like you'll never run out of things to write about if you go through all the yokai. And so I am interested in writing more about some of those. Some of them are very romantic in some ways. Like there's one that's like this woman who appears as bones to everyone, but like this man who's in love with her, and he sees her as like a normal person. So there's stuff like that. And there's also creepy stuff like people who live inside of walls. Though a lot of those ideas feel more like short story ideas than like full length book ideas to me. So I don't have anything planned in terms of folklore or mythology for yokai at the moment, but I do think they're very interesting for shorter works.
When you said about the hair cutting thing, I was like, whoa, wouldn't it be really funny if there was like Rapunzel and then all of a sudden there's a yokai who comes and is like, nope, denied. And the hair just like, that's the end. I guess that's the end of the story.
Oh, sorry.
Right, you're stuck here. That's sucks for you. We had a lot of interesting questions, but I think they are gonna take a little bit more time. I'm just scrolling through. Oh, I think this is a cool one. Are there, hold on, wait, I lost it. Okay, while I find one, I wanted to know if you have a favorite dragon. Because we've talked tangentially a lot about dragons, and I wanted to know if anyone has a favorite dragon. It can be your own dragon or someone else's dragon.
Mine is definitely Haku from Spirited Away.
Yeah, Haku instantly came to mind because he's just so wonderful and so beautiful. My first introduction to dragons, like as a literary figure, was in 4th grade. My 4th grade teacher had us do an extra unit of study every year. So it was like math, history, spelling, dragons. And so I had to do a book report on dragons. And so I went out and found the Dragon Riders of Pern series when I was like 9 years old. And so like that was my very first introduction, kind of like my very first love of dragon kind, like these huge, dangerous, fire-breathing, Western, but telepathic dragons. I have not been back to that series. I hear it is quite problematic, but that kind of was my first introduction to dragons, and so it does hold a special place in my heart.
Yeah, I would agree with Haku, obviously. We love him. But another dragon I love is the Dog Dragon Falkor from the Never-Ending Story. And my dog looks like Falkor. He's like white. He's always white. And he has the same sort of like face. At least from the film. I actually have never read the book. I know it's good, but I've never read it.
It's weird.
It's weird? I love
yeah. I read it as part of the research for the reader. And like the first part is like the movie, and then it gets wild after that.
That sounds great. I want to read that. I love wild, like all this story about the weasel cyclone. Like when you said that, Kylie, I was just like, oh, that sounds amazing. I want to read a book about this weasel, a cyclone of weasels. I would read that. 400 pages of just that. But yeah, I guess I'm gonna throw Falkor out there. I love that dragon.
I think as a kid, I was actually really afraid of dragons because when, like in Sleeping Beauty, the dragon that Maleficent becomes is really, really frightening. And I think I watched that when I was like 2 or 3, and that was my first real interaction with dragons, aside from the Chinese painted ones that I saw, but never in film. And so probably like one of my favorite childhood dragons would actually be from Dealing with Dragons by Patricia Reed, where the dragons are like these friendly creatures with whom you have afternoon tea. And like, I don't know, they seemed so different from the other Western dragons that I had come across. And then I didn't really see like East Asian dragons in action until I was a little older. So those are the dragons that had stronger impressions on me when I was a kid.
I was gonna say that was like one of my first dragon books too. I love that series.
I love it so much. It's so funny.
Yeah, it really it's like my first like fairy tale parody, and I was like, oh, well, like I didn't know you can like turn a story, upside down the way that she did. Yeah.
Before we move on from dragons, I just want to shout out to Mushu in Mulan. I love that character. He's my Disney Plus little avatar as Mushu. So.
Oh yes, I'm unmuted. Okay, and then I guess the last quick question that we have are: if your main character was stuck on a desert island, what 3? I want to look for the word. I feel like these desert island questions they have to be very specific in what you can and cannot have. What 3 things would they take with them to the desert island, I guess?
Okay, in 1,000 Seasons a Night, my character does end up kind of on a desert island, and what she has with her are a cricket, a forest god turned into a cricket, and she has a girl who tried to summon her, a demon, to kill her lover who had moved on to someone else, and those are the things that she has with her, and that's how she gets off of the island also.
Speaking of crickets, I also have a person who turns into a cricket, so that's really funny. Yeah, this is a tough question because like I'm assuming that they already have their basic survival necessities, so I wouldn't waste my 3 things on like food and water and toilet paper. I guess they would need a weapon, so I would say the Rui Jingu Bang. I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna pass and give up.
Yeah, I was thinking with Tracy's answer, I was like, okay, so what items does my main character already have in the book? So she has her grandmother's knife, so she can, use that to cut things, I guess. And then I was like, well, what other items does she have? Oh wait, she has maybe she'll have like a dragon's pearl, and then she can make a wish, and then she's off the island. So plant, all problems solved.
Yeah. Don't even need the 3rd item. You have the 2.
My character literally has like nothing.
Oh, she's Kiki.
Yeah, she's Kiki. That's true. She'd probably just send Kiki off to find the dragons and have a dragon bring her out of the island.
I think we're just cheating. We're just like, what powerful magical item or creature could just get you off this island?
In the meantime, she'd bring a pot so she can boil some soup.
My main character swam across the English Channel in the first book, so I kind of feel like she would just swim off the island. But she also, like, canonically does not need to eat anything, so I don't think she'd be that bothered.
And technically, she can't die, right?
Yeah, so well, not for a while.
Yeah.
Not by sitting on an island. So
Island holds no threat for our character.
So she just enjoy a vacation there. It'll be super chill.
I'm sure she'd complain a lot, but it'd be fine.
Nobody to kill.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for chatting. Also, thank you so much for a very lively chat. I was trying to read it at the same time. It was very difficult, but thank you all for, excuse me, attending. Wait, I realized I need to drop the giveaway link. So here's the giveaway link. I totally forgot about that. Here it is. And it will be up for probably, I think 2 weeks, because I'm going to be busy next week. So, so it'll be open for 2 weeks. Thank you all so much. Thank you all to our lovely authors, to our lovely chat for hanging out and chatting. Many other questions that were said that were really awesome. And make sure I left the bookshop links for all the books down below. So you definitely should buy all of the books because some people have backlist books. Sequels are already out. Sequels are coming out. Like there's just a lot to read from everybody's work. And yeah, I had a really great time, and I hope that everyone has a really great day, afternoon, nighttime, evening, dinner time, whatever it is for you, wherever you are.
Yeah, this was so fun. Thank you for having us.
Amazing.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.